You're watching The Lookout, a production of the Division of World Languages and Cultural Studies here at Minot State University. I'm your host, Samuel Stinson. On the program today, we are delighted to have on board Jim Ward. Jim Ward is an author, game designer, and former editor for TSR. He very well knew and played at the same table with the original game master, Gary Gygax, and played some of the first games of Dungeons and Dragons with the creator of the game. He's written books, many games, and we are definitely pleased to have you for our conversation time here today. Jim Ward, thank you so much for being on the program.
No, thank you for asking. I appreciate it.
So you authored the novels Pool of Radiance with Jane Cooper Hong, and the second and third novels Pools of Darkness and Pool of Twilight with Anne K. Brown. So my question is, in terms of the collaborative approach that you took to these novels, why did you decide to write these three novels together with other writers? And what was it like having that process of collaborative work with these books?
Oh, I don't think you're going to like the answer very much. We were all working at TSR, and we all had normal jobs. And we did a license with SSI. They're a computer game company. And they wanted to call their first computer game Pool of Radiance, and they really wanted some support from us. So we did a D&D adventure called Pool of Radiance, and they were looking around for someone to write the novels. And they really wanted me to get in on that because I was the guy who approved all the computer games, so I really knew what was happening with that design. But I was very busy. So what they did was they said, Jim, would you please write the book, and we'll give you a helper to write some more and to edit it. And I said, fine, I'll be happy to do that. So Jane came on, and she and I wrote the first book. And in the process, I would write a chapter, and she would rewrite the chapter and correct all my horrible spelling. I think I've discovered that all game designers are terrible spellers. And this was way before spell check on the computer. So I just wrote down Raw Ward, spelling a million wrong things, and she corrected all that. And the same process happened. Jane left the company. And so Anne volunteered to write the second and third novels with me. And so I would write the chapter, and she would rewrite the chapter and fix all my spellings. And so that's how the partnerships grew.
And I have to say, Pool of Radiance was the very first novel I read as a young person. It got me interested in reading. Yours was kind of the gateway novel for me into the other D&D, AD&D books.
Oh, that's high praise. Thank you very much.
And this one kind of goes back also, the Double Diamond Triangle Saga. The Double Diamond Triangle Saga. I saw this years ago, and I picked it up and read through it. This was, for our viewers, this was where I believe there were 9 short novellas together in a set, and they all told one coherent story. And each was written by a single author or duo who kind of carried the ball forward, right? I'd asked Ed Greenwood about this, I think some odd years back at Gen Con. And I wanted to ask you also, what was it like to have that type of development cycle where you've got so many different authors in one project?
Well, now, see, I didn't have to worry about the so many different authors. They gave me book 2 with David Weiss. David Weiss and I wrote it, and it was about a paladin. So my job was super easy. They gave me the storyline. They told me where they wanted to go, and then we had to write up this small book that sold for $2.95. And there were 9 books in the series. It kind of emulated what Stephen King had done with a series of his books, and they sold really well. And they're really hard to get right now, as a matter of fact. And I keep bending over here. I'm fixing my audio as we go. So yeah, the process was super easy for a writer because we didn't have to deal with the 9 different stories. We only had to deal with our one story.
So the editors of that kind of talked about what that section would be about, or did you come up with the original content? How did that work?
They had a 9-book outline, and every book had its own section in the outline, and they had a goal that they wanted that character to perform in the storyline. And so that's that. So the writing of it was easy. Nobody had any problem doing that set of stories.
I also grew up playing, and am thrilled to talk with you because the again, the Pool of Radiance NES game. I went back and played the gold box games on PC, and they're wonderful. But the NES game is also what I grew up with. Also, that was the game that I would rent frequently from the video back in the day, right, with video rental stores.
Mm-hmm.
But I must have digested that game constantly, frequently. Could you talk a little bit about what that was like? So this was the game version adaptation of Pool of Radiance. What was that like in terms of the development, since you were integral to the process and development? Could you tell us a little bit more about how that all worked and how that came
Sure,
together?
sure. That's not a problem at all. The SSI company got a license from us, TSR, to do TSR AD&D games. And so what they would do, the process was they would show me an outline of the game and what they wanted to accomplish and the main areas of the game, like the town of Falan and the dungeons underneath the town. And we would approve the outline, and then they'd start working on the characters that you played in the game, and we would approve those. And then they started writing about the encounters. And of course, the encounters had to match AD&D, but some of the pieces didn't work well with computer games. For example, um, healing one hit point a day. That wasn't good for a computer game because it's so fast going through these things. And so we had to change that so they would heal up when they camped. And so that was a parting of the rules, but I had to approve that because they convinced me that if we didn't do something like that, then the game wouldn't be as popular. So I was always the rules arbiter in the game. And Chuck Krogel was the head of the department over at SSI, and he did a brilliant job of translating the game into AD&D.
And I have to say, in terms of the play side of the game, it worked phenomenally. I really like the differences between the gold box PC/Commodore 64 version of the game and the NES version of the game, primarily because it seemed like the NES version inherited the newer rule set from AD&D, but also it seemed like there was a lot more to do in terms of the overworld exploration. That was actually my most fascinating times with the game was actually going out and doing the adventures in town, of course, and then going out and just exploring and seeing what else was out there and what kind of random encounters I could find. And finding centaurs and quicklings and the others was always just icing on the cake for me.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
so that's excellent to be able to hear more about that development. So let me ask you a little bit more about this question. And you'd mentioned this might be a little more controversial. So some of the more recent changes with D&D have had to do with the drow specifically, right? But other creatures, other types. So maybe could you walk us through this? What all is going on with this topic? Is it really just about being able to have playable monsters as playable characters, or to reconsider something that's essentially bad as an evil character like an orc or a goblin? What is that all really about?
All right. I'm an old guard. I really liked AD&D 1 and AD&D 2. And with AD&D 5e, I think they've done an excellent job describing the game and defining the game so that the 8, 9, and 10-year-old can figure it out. The first and second edition were college level text and a little bit difficult to get into unless you played it with someone who knew how to play. So that part they've done just a terrific job doing. However, they're pulling the teeth from the game. They're making it less violent on purpose. What's happened is this. Hasbro company bought Wizards of the Coast, and Hasbro has a huge multi-million-dollar marketing arm. And so for Hasbro to make a decision on things, they send out their marketers and they do canvassing of their age groups. And a Hasbro game is an 8, 9, and 10-year-old game. And so they've asked them, how do you feel about dying in D&D? And of course, the 8, 9, and 10-year-olds hate it. They don't want to die. And so Hasbro overreacted and now is saying, we don't want anybody to die in our role-playing game because our market doesn't like it. Well, their market isn't just 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. There's an old guard of 30-year-old plus people who play the game and love the game. There's millions of these people all over the world. And we realize that death is part of the game. We realize that, you get knocked out in some fights and that's just life. So we get back up and we start playing again. But Hasbro's view is that their 8, 9, and 10-year-olds are going to die and never play the game again. So what they're doing is they're pulling out the teeth. And it's the idea of the worst one, of course, is the orcs. They've decided that orcs aren't all bad. Now, Gary Gygax had a subtle line in his games that was never spoken about, and that was good triumphs over evil. He wanted to press that button all the time in his game, and he wanted all the players to realize if you were a good guy, you had a much easier path than if you were a bad guy. And so he set up evil characters. He set up orcs and goblins and kobolds. He set up demons and devils, and it was to make challenges for the player. So when they saw an orc, they knew it was evil. And so they knew they should attack it and get rid of the evil. Well, now that isn't the case anymore. The orcs of Wizards of the Coast aren't all evil. There's some good ones, there's some neutral ones, there's some evil ones. Well, that's stripping the teeth out of the game. When I played in Gary Gygax's game, I sat on the edge of my seat worried about my character life every single minute of the game. If I made a bonehead mistake, my character died. It was just the part of the game. Well, they don't have that with AD&D now. You don't worry so much about dying because they don't want you to die. They don't want it to be as violent. And so I think they're stripping away the urgency, the interesting death-defying aspect of the game to appease the 8, 9, and 10-year-old who isn't their main market anyway. So I don't like what's happening right now, this instant with Wizards.
It seems like there's other systems or other old style games, right, coming up to kind of fill the void, right?
Oh, there's tonnage of new games on the marketplace all the time. I just finished writing 2 new game systems. There's still millions and millions of players out there, and they play one game for a while and they want to go to something else, and so they look around for new games to play. And of course, there's different marketing techniques to attract them. There's certainly online gaming that's growing more and more and more. So people on either side of the ocean, or people in Japan can play with people in Germany, can play with people in England. So the online aspect is growing by leaps and bounds. And again, you want to have a point of difference in your games. All the games that I design are different from other games in some aspect, and I hope that aspect appeals to the gamer. I just finished a major game design with a Canadian company called Odoron. And that's just a big fantasy world. But this Canadian company is a graphics novel company. And what they want to do, I think, is a very interesting idea. They want to put a chunk of graphic novel in front of all the products that they come out with in this new fantasy world, so that the graphic novel chunk kind of explains how to play the game and explains what the characters and the creatures look like. I think it's a brilliant idea. I think it's going to go really well. And I just finished, in December, I finished a game called Giant Lands, and it was all about giants in the world, and Gaia, the mother goddess, getting irritated at mankind for all its depredations and ruining them and bringing the giants back into the land. But the point of difference here is Giant Land is going to become a theme park and enjoy being a character in the game. And then you're going to be able to take that character and go to a theme park and play that character in the park. I think it's a fascinating idea. And he's getting the financing now for the park in line to make that happen. So hopefully in a couple of years, you'll be able to walk into the Giant Lands theme park and enjoy your character there.
But that's one thing that I was noted about Gen Con, going to that or to these other gaming conventions, was you show up, you do a one shot with a character, and it's fun. You have a nice group of a good time with some strangers. You play the game, but where's that continuity of character? Some games repeat, some games you can't get back in. But I'm really intrigued by this notion of being able to play a game, have that character set, and then go bring it in that live action context. This is
It's
really
gonna be
interesting.
fun. It's just a great idea. Stephen Deinhardt is the creator of that idea. He's up in Madison, Wisconsin, and when I heard about it, I leaped to become part of that design work. So the game's come out. It's very successful. It has its own Facebook page, and you can also look for giantlands.com to check that out. And it has its own website. And I just think it's a fun project that worked out very well.
So I've got one more question, and it's about
Just one more question? Oh, come
yeah,
on.
just one more. Well, let me think about that. Well, I have to ask this question because I teach creative writing, and back when I took creative writing as a student, I think I was the only one wanting to write about more creative or fantasy themes in genre fiction, and I was really pushed against in my earlier training. But when I've taught creative writing now, a good portion of the students now are interested in these. They've had their interest opened up by D&D novels and George R.R. Martin books and fan fiction and all these different things that were really just on the horizon. I'll say 20 years ago when I took these classes. But I will say this: if you were to give some advice to young writers starting out today in fantasy writing, knowing how things are different these days, what would that advice be?
Ooh, well, of course, for me, we have two different fantasy authors. We have the guy who wants to get into the game business and the guy who wants to get into the novel business. All right. And in both of them, you have to walk before you can run. So what I would advise is if you want to become a game designer, you get on some of these game websites like Troll Lord Games or Goodman Games, and you see what they're doing and how they're doing it. And you submit a proposal to them and a finished product to them, because proposals are a dime a dozen. But if you finish a product, they know that you have skills and you can get things done. And the very same thing works with novels and short stories. So if you want to become a novelist, you have to start by writing not just a novel, because that's kind of hard to do to begin with, but short stories are easy to do. I recall a famous author named Fritz Leiber, and he was a fantasy author, and he wrote novels, but his novels were a series of short stories about Fafford and the Gray Mouser. Fafford and the Gray Mouser were two kind of thief rogue people, and he wouldn't write a huge book from beginning to end on just one set of things that those two guys did. He would write a book with 10 or 12 short stories, all linked together. And so he wasn't really writing a novel. He was writing short stories, but when he was done, it looked like a novel. And
It
so
read
that's
like a
what
novel.
it did read like a novel. And so that's what I propose. You have to learn how to write. And the big thing, of course, is writing every day. I write 3,000 words every day. Doesn't matter if it's Christmas, doesn't matter if it's my birthday. I write 3,000 words, and you have to do that to learn your craft. You have to experience the writing. You have to read it out loud. That's one thing that a good friend of mine, Roger Moore, taught me. You do something, you read it out loud to see how it sounds to you. Okay? Giving it to friends to read is hardly ever worthwhile. Why? Because your friends love you. Because your friends will never tell you the truth. They'll never say, this thing sucks rocks. They will not do it. So giving it to the friends isn't quite as good as giving it to people who are, totally removed from you. That's why writing classes are so handy, because your teacher will give you the facts. He won't sugarcoat it. And so you just have to write. That's the big thing with getting things done. I'm also a big supporter of outlines. I outline everything: the game rules, the game adventures, the novels, the short stories. Everything is an outline, because it helps with writer's block. It helps focus yourself down to what you want to get done. I just highly recommend writing outlines for anything you do.
Once folks here see this interview, I'm sure they'll have a lot of questions to say, why didn't you ask him about this? Why didn't you ask him about that?
Yeah, really. Why didn't you ask him about Metamorphosis Alpha and Gamma World? People want to know.
Maybe I should ask you about that right now.
Well, Metamorphosis Alpha I did in 1974. It was the first science fiction role-playing game. I'm very proud of it. It's still for sale now, which is very rare for a role-playing game. And then Gamma World came out in 76, and that was the first apocalyptic role-playing game. So basically what happens is we printed TSR, printed 50,000 of the Metamorphosis Alpha, and they sold out right away. And then the fans started writing. Metamorphosis Alpha is essentially a story in a tin can in outer space. It's a colonization starship that gets lost, and it's floating out there, but it's filled with people. It's filled with creatures that are irradiated and mutating. And so that's what you find yourself in Metamorphosis Alpha. And those fans wanted a planet-based game. They wanted a bigger environment to play in. And so that's what Gamma World became. Gamma World, I was really nasty to Gamma World. We destroyed it in several different ways. I had asteroids hit it. I had a nuclear war. I had a plague cover it. I had aliens come down and affecting the mentality of the inhabitants. I just did lots of different disasters all at once, and then you play in what's left. And they're both well received. Wizards of the Coast still does Gamma World, and I write Metamorphosis Alpha material.
I saw on Facebook also that you are doing independent work now with Patreon. Could you talk about that?
Oh, sure. And in fact, I just started a couple days ago. I hate to admit that I'm a computer idiot. I know hardly anything about. I can write text, but that's about all I can do. So I have some computer genius friends who said, "Jim, you ought to present your material on Patreon. It's kind of a rental process where in my case, there's 6 different categories, and each category is more money a month." And so what I do is every week I have some kind of presentation on Patreon. Every week I do monsters and devices for Metamorphosis Alpha, for fantasy, and for an apocalyptic game. And that's what I do every week. And then every month I do things like novel chapters and stories about Gary Gygax and stories about TSR. People seem to really like hearing those stories for some strange, bizarre reason. But I've got 40 years of stories, so that isn't a problem for me to present. And so I put those on sale on Patreon every single week and every single month.
Well, Jim Ward, thank you so much for being on the program today. Thank you so much for spending time and letting us ask you questions about your illustrious and legendary history and games.
I don't like the word legendary, but okay.
We've reached that point of the program now where we have to bid you adieu, but we thank you so much again for watching. Again, we'll close the show as we always do by saying, this is Minot State University. Be seen, be heard, be inspired, and thanks again.